Welcome back to the podcast. It's so good to be here today, and I've got a really exciting program ahead of us. Today I'm with a consultant clinical psychologist. She's author of Users and Abusers of Psychiatry, Formulation in Psychology and Psychotherapy, Making Sense of People's Problems, a straight-talking guide to psychiatric diagnosis, taking a critical perspective on mental health theory and practice. Background in adult mental health settings for many years, lead author on the Power, Threat, Meaning Framework, which is really something I'm massively interested in, and has had a long career, including clinical work, lecturing and writing. Welcome, Dr. Lucy Johnstone.
Thank you, and please call me Lucy.
Hello, Lucy.
Lovely to meet you. I think we've been aware of each other without actually connecting, but anyway, we're now connected, so that's good.
Yeah, it's so good to see you. And the last time I saw you, you were speaking at a Drop the Disorder conference, and undoubtedly we will speak about what that is as we go along.
Yeah.
So, God, there's so many places I could start, and I'm so interested in talking to you, not least because I have spent all my career really trying to create and be part of what I believe we're now in this wave of holistic services that stop thinking that children aren't going to become adults and adults were never children. And so my interest in you is very much, you are a massive part of that wave. So in your long career that's been around all of that area, around clinical work, what is the common thread and where does that fit around thinking about holistic services?
Okay, so as you say, my career goes back quite a long way, and I've done lots of different things. And I've had lots of areas of interest, most recently trauma-informed practice, which you will know much more about than I do, but which I think is a fascinating area. But there is a common thread, and actually it predates training as a clinical psychologist. It probably goes back to when I was about 10 or 11. This is not a healthy thing to admit, but that's the age when I first started reading psychology and psychotherapy books, I'm afraid. And so the common thread really is believing very strongly, and this is partly from my own experience, that people in all kinds of distress feel that way for reasons in their lives, for reasons to do with things that they've had to survive and things they've struggled with and are struggling with. And that's in kind of complete opposition to the dominant way we have of understanding distress, which is that it's some kind of medical illness that needs diagnosing, and we would use words like treatment and medication and so on. And that's still the bedrock of services, although that's not the only thing they offer, that is the main thing they offer. And from my perspective, and I've always believed this, that's not only not accurate, not helpful, it's actively unhelpful. And I'm sure you will know what I mean when I say it's very often re-traumatizing. It is a scandal. I think it's a scandal that's too close to us to see how horrendous it is. But like you, I think, I feel a change. I feel a change in the air. I mean, you've been around for a few years. I've been around for a few years. I think you might agree with me that actually things do feel different. It does feel like things are shifting a bit. And that gives me hope.
Yeah, and you know what? I think there are very key reasons why that shift is finally happening. And I think that has a lot to do with lived experience, voices, having an opportunity to find each other and create something that has reduced shame. So by finding each other through social media, which of course is relatively new to the party, that isolation, that individualization, that sense of it's just me, I'm the only person this has happened to, there's nobody I can talk with about this, they don't understand me, they're the expert, they must be right. All of that is just evaporating. Not for everybody, and the resistance is huge, but there's an evaporation, I think, because of that opportunity for people to come together. So we start to see things like Drop the Disorder, relational activism, you know, areas that give people those spaces. I mean, do you think that's a core component, or is it the only component? I mean, what has created this sea wave?
Well, if I think back 30 years, then certainly the service user and survivor movement has been a key driver of change. And when service users and survivors, and perhaps one day all of us, get together to say no thanks to what we're being offered, then things have to change. I think that's a very key part of it. I also think, you know, we've been sold this myth about, you know, one day we'll identify the biochemical imbalance, the kind of, you know, genetic contribution, the whatever it is. And all those kind of statements are, with increasing knowledge and investigation research, kind of crumbling. It's become quite clear that these kind of biological causal factors don't exist. I also think we have much more credible alternative explanatory frameworks like trauma-informed practice, and, you know, the power threat meaning framework is meant to be part of that. So I think it's all those things. But although I agree with you that social media has helped us to kind of, you know, everyone to have more of a voice, the trouble is we're still being encouraged to have a voice in a particular way. So that if the people who are bravely telling their stories, and good luck to them, and I would never dispute their right to tell their story in their way, they are being very strongly encouraged to tell it still in a particular way. There's a particular set of discourses around, isn't there, to use a jargon word. So our most high profile celebrities are talking still very much in, you know, my bipolar disorder or my personality disorder or my psychosis or whatever. So it's kind of a mixed picture, I think. As you would expect, it's kind of a mixed picture.
Yeah, and I think that's such a good point, because it's that whole thing about how we have voice, who controls that voice,
Indeed.
who,
Absolutely. Absolutely.
who gives us space.
Never simple.
Yeah, who gives us space to have that voice? Lots of people share their story with a view of making a difference and being helpful and being part of something, but do so and don't get paid to do so, while being asked to do so by people who are paid to do so. So there's already that imbalance as well, that can come up in conferences where, you know, large sums of money are taking place to go to the conference. So I think you're absolutely right. It is, God, I mean, where do we start with that? You know, I went to, I don't know if you're familiar with the Camden's growing model around relational activism and family group conferences.
I only since yesterday when I looked at it on your website, so no, not very familiar.
Yeah, well, that's another space like that, really. And it's almost a bit unnerving, because I went to a lovely event on Valentine's Day. No one had a job title. Which was really nice. So we were all just there as we were, as we bring ourselves, and that's a really lovely thing. And also, somebody was looking for the person in charge, and there was no one in charge, and that was really nice as well. And it all worked, and voice was really shared. And so I think there are ways of doing that are so much better than what we've seen before.
It's about power. You know, I'm sure we'll come back to that. The power threat meaning framework is about being really, really aware of the role of power in all its guises. And part of what you're talking about is power, isn't it? Whose voices are given space, who allows who to speak, in whose interest do they speak? How is that taken up? How is that responded to, particularly by people in more powerful positions?
Yeah, and that cuts across all the sectors, doesn't it?
It cuts across all the sectors, yeah. And the space you're talking about sounds great. And we've tried to do something similar, I guess, with the A Disorder for Everyone events, which are very much, you know, co-led by survivors and professionals, where Jo Watson does 90% of the work, but she does, you know, she's absolutely prioritises giving free and reduced price places as much as we can. It's not a kind of thing we're all in it to make money out of. It's a thing we're into because we believe in it very passionately, and we want to offer choices and spread different ideas. And, you know, it's a bit of a jargon word, but it empower people, I guess, if they find those messages interesting.
And I really felt that. I mean, I really felt that with both of those quite different sort of energies and drivers, really.
Yeah.
But I felt that from both, and I often hashtag both together because I just think they are models that are really worth people who want to think about how are we going to do this differently. They are models for thinking about how do we make that work in our setting, sector, area, etc.
It's hard work because, you know, it's not something you do and then you've done it. It's a process, and we all have to constantly keep an eye on the power that we have and make sure that we're sharing it, don't we? And we're not falling back into old dynamics, but it's the only way to go, isn't it? It's the only way to go.
Yeah, and the whole trauma-informed practice element of that is part of that kind of social justice movement. And that has, you know, I've watched, you know, it's difficult, isn't it? Because I'm part of something that I'm also watching becoming a space that isn't a space for people actually to have voice.
Yeah. It's kind of predictable, but the trauma-informed stuff, properly understood, as I see it, is an enormously powerful, challenging approach to the status quo that actually supports people to understand what's difficult in their lives. And one would predict that such a challenge is going to be kind of, you know, it's not so much the active opposition that's often the trouble. You can often see that quite clearly what it is. It's the assimilation, isn't it? It's the ACEs turned into a kind of checklist. You know, it's the kind of disconnecting strategies, you know, which can be very useful, but disconnecting them from social injustice contexts. You know, so we end up with another set of kind of skills and a kind of model that's in a box and puts people in boxes, which is exactly what we're trying to escape from.
Absolutely. And that's the difficulty, isn't it? We're asking people to, I mean, we can get onto resistance in a minute, because I think that's the next kind of stage, really, because that resistance actually comes from, I think, the fact that it's so difficult to actually, for our culture, to not other people, to want to have that power to, you know, I think the othering element is what's really difficult. But yeah, I mean, where are you at with that? I mean, what do you think we can, because I feel like I'm really in the middle of that, and I'm also thinking about how do I want to change what I'm doing so that people don't fall into that trap of medicalizing again. You know, remove the DSM, which I meant to say earlier, unfortunately, we're still in a culture where the more, you know, you need diagnoses to access funding, and of course that's a massive challenge. But you know, how are we going to prevent that
assimilation, isn't it? Assimilation, co-option is better, perhaps, because co-option implies an active process of power, you know, enacting itself to neutralize threats, if you like. I think that is
exactly, it's the micro and the macro playing out, and the fact that it's so difficult to articulate shows how difficult a space it is. I think
it is. How do we resist that? I don't know. I mean, partly by being aware of it, isn't it? Partly by being aware of it. And I think there's another aspect of that in this particular issue, I mean, this happens in all sorts of arenas where power is challenged, but in this particular area, nobody wants to know about trauma, do they? And Judith Herman has written about that incredibly insightfully, and hasn't she, about how at every level we don't want to know about trauma. It's too much for us as individuals sometimes to be aware of what actually the impact has been on us of things that have happened to us. It's too much for other people to hear, it's too much for systems to deal with, it's too much for societies to acknowledge. So I think that also drives a very powerful process of sort of, you know, box it in again. But I have to say that that's one of the drivers for the power threat meaning framework. I mean, it's not just about trauma-informed practice. I'm afraid it's ludicrously ambitious, and it's bigger than, But one of the things we wanted it to do was to provide a framework within which or under which all sorts of approaches that are forward-looking and holistic and person-centered and trauma-informed, find a safe home where we don't lose the connection with the wider issues of social injustice and inequality. So a very key aspect of the framework is to say we need to show how social injustice and inequality and the misuse of power in all its forms, including ideological power, links to personal distress. That's a main aim of the framework. And so we have borrowed a lot from the trauma-informed literature in the framework, but we've also included some critiques of it. I'd want to update those actually now, but this was 2 or 3 years ago now. We foresaw this kind of thing happening, trauma being reduced to a sort of tick box, and dissociative disorder, well, it's better than schizophrenia, but what's the D for disorder doing in there, and all that kind of stuff. The danger of co-option and assimilation. And the only answer is awareness, in a way. The only answer is awareness. As soon as we stop being aware of those forces and how they're being enacted, we get sucked into it.
And I guess that involves a deep reflection, doesn't it? That's about being very reflective all the time in all our relationships.
It is.
Yeah.
And having this kind of conversation and then putting it out on a podcast.
Yeah, exactly. Stimulating reflection. I mean, I'm really quite interested in, you must have faced so much resistance. I mean, there you are in psychiatry, which is like, some might say the granddaddy of oppression. I mean, some might not say that.
I might say it.
You might say it.
I might agree with you and then say, she said it.
But to be in that particular discipline, as a woman, year after year, standing up and saying, no, this is not right. This is not okay. We are medicalizing trauma. You must have faced so much resistance.
Yeah, I have. And I kind of chose to be there. Do you know what I mean? I've always chosen to work in psychiatry at the kind of sharp end. I didn't have to choose that. Clinical psychologists are fortunate enough to be able to make quite a number of choices in their career. So I always want, it's, how can we talk about that? It's been very, very difficult, but I don't see myself as fighting this battle on my own. I've always had allies, I've always had supporters, and I see myself as part of a wider group. And the PTM Framework authors, it's a very incestuous group of people who've known each other for years, if not decades. I've known Mary Boy for 30 years. So and I've always been, wherever I've worked, I've been lucky enough to have really good colleagues. Not necessarily psychologists. Quite often the psychologists have been the most difficult people to deal with. So it's been difficult, and that's partly why I haven't worked continuously in services. So I have had quite long breaks in training settings. I'm not sure if anyone could work continuously in services for 30 plus years without burning out, certainly not if they're taking a kind of challenging position. But I've also gained a great deal from it, I think. I've also gained a great deal, and I used to head up a clinical psychology training course, and one of the things I used to say to our trainees when they'd got thoroughly depressed about what is this system we're going into, and now you're telling us that it's got all these problems, what are we doing here? I used to say, well, think of it this way, a single conversation can change lives. You could be on the most oppressive locked ward with someone who's been in services for years, and you can have a conversation that actually offers a different way forward. And I've been privileged to have some of those conversations with people. So have other people I know. If you read the accounts of the personal accounts of some of our most prominent survivor activists, often the turning point is the person who offered me this perspective, the book I read, this particular person who took the time to spend a bit of time with me, introduce me some different ways forward. So there's struggle and resistance, and there's hope. And I find it very, it's important to me to spend my life doing something I think is meaningful. And that's important for you too, I know. And as you will also know, that as difficult as it is, it's also rewarding and meaningful and important.
Yeah, and I think having your tribe, as you described, and also having the ability to have that self-care.
Oh,
Um,
I'm very bad at that.
are you? I'm pretty good at it, and I still got exhausted because I think I was doing, this is a bit personal, but I was trying to have my kind of supervision session yesterday, and one of the things that's really hard about training is this continuously going into a new space with new people who you have no idea about, who have a variety of needs, who you don't know what they bring to the party. You're not there to do any of the repair work afterwards, even though you might be opening up things.
Yeah, yeah.
And doing that over and over and over again, sometimes 2 to 3 times a week.
Yeah, it's very exhausting. You're
It's
on the whole
really,
time, aren't you? You're on
yeah,
the whole time. Yeah.
it's really exhausting. But I also felt, and this is the kind of personal bit, because my lived experience stuff is around having been in care as a child. And it's a little bit like that. We were kind of mirroring the two, that I'd ended up doing something work-wise that is not about having those long-term meaningful relationships professionally. And there was something really interesting for me about that, because by staying in service, by working in that way, those long-term relationships with everybody they're the messy space, aren't they?
The messy space, the you and one other person in a room, perhaps, or whatever. That's the cold face stuff, isn't it?
Yeah.
Exhausting and demanding and incredibly meaningful and rewarding. Yeah. And
Yeah.
I'm in a position of view at the moment, in the sense that I'm just doing training. I'm not doing therapeutic work or working in services. And, it's great when it goes well. It gives you a real buzz. It is tiring and exhausting. And, one of the things it doesn't give you is that messy, difficult, but exciting, rewarding, meaningful, challenging, very intimate relationships, in a sense, within boundaries, that working actually in services gives you.
Yeah. And I think that's, you can't have both. I don't think unless you're doing a bit of training and a bit of clinical
Yeah.
work,
Yeah. Yeah.
you kind of have to take your choice, don't you, about how that's going to be. But it was an interesting reflection for me to think about. There is a gap there,
Yeah.
and the not having the relationships and being in the messy space, whether that's with colleagues or who I'm working with, there's something missing there in the relating process.
There is, but it's fine to have a break from it. You might want to go back to it. I might want to go back to it.
Yes, absolutely. But I think maybe there's something in there about the resistance, because if you're if you're bringing all of that stuff into the training room, but you're not the person who is doing the do of it,
Yeah.
then some of that resistance is very natural, surely, because you're catapulting yourself into this environment, and off you go. I think there's something in there that I need to reflect further on about the resistance element, because there is, we are seeing some of that tick box stuff, very much so. And I'm navigating how best to work with that rather than not to do it. Seeing that around adverse childhood experiences, we're seeing it around trauma-informed practice. And in fact, I've stopped calling it anything trauma-informed practice, because that's the point.
Trauma is becoming a kind of cliche, isn't it? And I mean, in the framework, we deliberately use the word adversity for all sorts of reasons, but more easily, accommodates sort of long-term backgrounds of deprivation and poverty and discrimination and so on. But also, trauma's in danger of becoming a cliche, isn't it? We have to constantly keep an eye on the vocabulary, don't we?
Yeah, and it's such, it's used as an umbrella term for just such a whole range of
for everything. Yeah.
So there's lots to be done there, but let's move on to the framework in more detail, because I came across the framework before I came across the Drop the Disorder group. I was looking up around some of the trauma research that I was doing. I wanted to have a look and see what else was out there, and I came across the framework, and I loved it because it located voice, which is something I've been passionate about for a long time, but also it managed to bring in that power dynamic. So maybe just talk us through how it came about and where you're at with it, really.
Okay, so the power threat meaning framework came about completely by accident. Nobody planned it. But in November 2012, a group of people, which is more or less the core authorship group as it remained, happened to be meeting in Manchester for completely different reasons. And as I said, we've all known each other for a long time. And we started to have a conversation about what would an alternative to the diagnostic model look like. Not just particular alternatives, you know, there's lots of good alternatives out there. I might say trauma-informed practice or formulation-based practice or open dialogue or narrative therapy, whatever, hearing voices work. But what would a complete conceptual framework that underpinned and supported all of those things look like to really move us away from the diagnostic model once and for all? So 5 hours later, we were all still excitedly throwing ideas at each other. And one of the interesting things was that although we were all people had a very common shared starting point in that none of us had believed or probably had ever believed in this stuff, it actually wasn't very easy to come up with, well, what would an alternative look like? So that was a big intellectual challenge, if you like. So that's how it started, quite informally. We decided to meet. We thought we'd do this just as an informal project group out of our own interests, and it fairly quickly became apparent that we needed at least some funding to kind of travel expenses and the research assistance and so on. So we applied for funding from the Division of Clinical Psychology, which is my professional body, and they gave us some funding, but it's important to note that this isn't an official DCP or British Psychological Society project. It's one of many that they fund. And then we were off, and then we spent about the whole project took 5 years to publication. And if we'd known how much work it was going to be and how much it's going to hurt all our heads and how despairing we were going to feel at certain points in the journey, we'd probably never have done it. Like I sometimes say, it's like having kids. If you knew how difficult it would be, you probably wouldn't do it, but thank goodness we don't know, because of course we never regret it. And we ended up with the framework, which just evolved in a kind of organic way. And Mary and I were the lead authors, and it was launched in January 2018, by which point I think we'd almost completely lost a perspective on, well, we had no idea what we were offering, if you like. So it's turned out to be, in its main version, as you know, a very long and dense academic document. It's 200,000 words long, which is a lot. There's a slightly shorter version. Neither of them, to be honest, are very easy to read. So we produced this dense academic document thinking, is anyone ever going to look at this? And extraordinarily enough, it's taken off in an amazing way. So what it is our best current attempt to outline a conceptual alternative to the diagnostic model, going back absolutely to first principles. So we've done a massive overview of the evidence, biological, social, psychological. We've done a kind of very thorough intellectual appraisal of the philosophical principles and the conceptual ideas and the theories. We've traced all those back to their roots. We've taken out of that what we think is useful. We consulted with a service user carer group as we went through. The document is co-produced with survivors, Jackie, Dylan, Eleanor Longdon. And it's, in Mary Boyle's memorable phrase, it's a way of getting away from the DSM mindset, which means not just we don't use the diagnostic terms, well, we don't, but it's the whole way of thinking that has sunk so deeply into our lives, our institutions, our media, our whole way of thinking of society. I mean, its roots go incredibly deep. One of the things we were interested to find as co-authors was, although we thought we hadn't believed this stuff for decades, we realised there were traces of that thinking in our own minds, and that's because it comes from a broader tradition of what you could call positivism. It's a whole way of thinking that has been around, for several hundred years, which is very productive in lots of ways in general medicine and so on. We wouldn't be without it. But what it is not good for is understanding the real life agentic, meaning-making human beings that we are trying to make sense of our life histories and our life struggles. It's not good for that. So the diagnostic model is just one particular version of positivism, and indeed some types of psychology are very positivistic in their outlook. You know, narrow versions of CBT would be the obvious example. So it's an alternative to that, and just very briefly, as you will probably have gathered, you know, it's taken off in an astonishingly exciting way. I've been to 9 countries now talking about it, sometimes with other members of the project group. We've collectively done about 250 workshops and talks and training events. We have a committee that's going to be kind of supporting us to take this further. There is a Spanish translation, there are going to be other translations. Who knows where it's going to go? And it was very much our aim that we offered this set of theoretical ideas to see if anyone wanted to take them up and translate into practice. It's not a how-to manual. It's not like an NHS 5-year plan. It's like, these are some principles. We don't know what they might look like in practice. We can make some suggestions, but it's up to other people, if they're interested, to think about what this might look in practice. And by in practice, we definitely didn't just mean in services. We very much wanted to take these ways of thinking beyond services. So one of the things that we're particularly pleased about is that some peer groups have taken this up entirely without professional support and found it very useful, you know, to give them different ideas about how they can understand their own difficulties. So the stage is, try it out and let us know. And through that, then the ideas will be refined, or some will turn out to work well, some will turn out to work less well. And again, we're kind of envisaging that of an organic process, and the useful bits we hope will survive and be developed. The less useful bits will need to be modified or changed, and there's the rest of it I sorted out.
Yeah, and I'm interested, while you were talking, I was thinking about resistance again, and I was thinking about how we're all impacted by that viewpoint on some level. And the resistance to the medical model is equally surely met by a resistance to letting go of it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, the resistance has been interesting, as you may have seen from social media. So we knew there'd be resistance. And in fact, had there been no resistance, that wouldn't have been a good sign, because to think that the first response to a challenge to power, and essentially that's what we're offering, a challenge to power. The first response is ignore it, pretend no one ever said this. The second response is attack. Interestingly, we seem to have leapfrogged over ignore and gone straight to attack. And the third response is, as we've already been discussing, assimilate. Take these bits. The framework's a nice new way of doing a formulation. You know, ignore everything else it says. The attacks, I mean, I have to be careful what I say here, because we are absolutely not saying this is a perfect way forward. We are very, very much open to and welcoming of constructive feedback. We've had lots of that. It's been great. That will be fed back into a future edition at some point. So it's really not about saying, you know, nobody's allowed to criticise this. That's one of the common responses we get. But you can tell the difference between feedback and resistance. And so even before anyone had read a word of this document, there's signs of huge resistance and really quite unpleasant personalised attacks and deliberate distortions of what we were supposedly going to say and all the rest of it. And that's continued, really. It's been quite remarkably unpleasant in some ways. And
well, I guess if you're saying to me that and again, I don't wish to, incite any kind of difficulty for anybody in thinking about this. But if you're saying to me that the challenges that I have are not a chemical imbalance, they're not something that I have no control over, then that means that I can have a go at doing something about it.
Yeah.
And that's going to be a resistance, isn't it? If you've spent your whole life feeling like you can't do something about it, and you've been actively told by people in power that you can't, that's
absolutely
deep, isn't it, for people?
It's massive, and these labels become part of people's identities. Of course they And, you know, they have many disadvantages, but they have some benefits. I mean, something literally benefits, you know, go along to the benefit office and all the rest of it. But I think it's really important to clarify that we're really not saying nobody's allowed to describe their problems in this way. And the bizarre thing is that, you know, if you want a diagnosis, nobody's going to stop you getting one. Nobody is at risk of having their labels stripped from them. But
yeah, I didn't pick that up from the framework at all. That you was, in fact, I didn't pick up any sense of it's either or. So it's interesting that, as you know, again, culturally, we're very dualistic, you know, so it's unsurprising that people think, oh, so it's that, but not that. But actually, maybe it is the Venn diagram. And I can't imagine for a minute you'd be asking people to let go of something when there isn't something else that you can hold on to. And I think holding on to understanding, you know, social justice, power imbalance, trauma, all of those things, that's not something you go to bed with one night and you wake up the next day and you're in that space. That is a journey. So it has to be a Venn diagram, doesn't it? It has to be a movement out of one space into another in collaboration with your tribe and in a way that you feel safe. You have to feel safe to do that. So I suppose, does the framework incorporate that sense of safety for that journey, would be my question. How do you help and support people? And I felt that safety present at the conference, even though I also felt spaces that didn't have the safety, again, of course, because it's human beings, but I felt spaces that very much did.
Okay, so I think it's important to reiterate that the framework is not saying anyone should think or do anything in particular, and indeed nobody has to read it, nobody has to like it, nobody has to do anything with it. It's a set of principles, it's a set of ideas. So one of the more worrying aspects of some of the resistance is that the message seems to me to be not just, I don't like this, I don't agree with it, I don't see my difficulties in this way, which is 100% fine, 100% fine. The message seems to be no one should ever have put these ideas forward. So that's worrying. It's worrying at all sorts of levels. It's worrying for the many people who do want to have a chance to think differently, but it's worrying in terms of, you know, well, it's another use of silencing, isn't it? We're not allowed to have these ideas circulating. They're too threatening. That's what's come across. So a sense of safety, I mean, you know, in terms of the framework, these are optional ideas, as I said. And in terms of how I talk about it, I'm always very careful to say, this is a set of ideas, no one has to agree, I welcome challenge. If this doesn't fit you, that's fine. If you want to go away and think about it, that's fine. If you want to decide immediately this isn't for you, that's fine. And if you want to take it a bit forward, we would be really interested in hearing about it. So, and as I say, it's not a how-to manual, but I would certainly hope that anyone who wanted to explore these ideas, you know, be in keeping with the principles of the framework, obviously, to do so in a safe and respectful and collaborative way.
Let's look at the framework. So power, threat, meaning. So do you want to break those down for people that aren't familiar with this framework?
Yeah, so, okay, so because it's such a long and complicated document, and I don't know if you have resources at the end, but I can give you some links and things for people to look at a kind of brief video or something. That's probably the easiest way of getting your head around it if you're interested, by the way. So we've broken it down into kind of 4 key questions, and the questions are not meant to be asked literally in those words in that order, but they are areas we need to consider. But it's a kind of simple way of getting your head around what we're talking about. So the first question is, what has happened to you, which is a survivor slogan, as I'm sure you know, from the trauma-informed field. And in PTM terms, that translates as, how is power operating in your life? So one of the main things we feel we've added to all of psychiatry, to a lot of psychology, to a lot of psychotherapy, is a very strong emphasis right up front on the role of power. Now, if you're sitting down with someone and talking to these questions with them for the sake of safety, you wouldn't necessarily want to start there with all the difficult things you struggled with. But in terms of our thinking, we need to locate power first and foremost in our theories, if you like. So there's a lot about power, and it's about the kinds of power we do acknowledge more widely, the power of other human beings to hurt us or neglect us or abuse us or whatever. It's also about power in terms of your economic and material resources, in terms of your place in the community, in terms of your bodily health or disability or whatever, in terms of your identity and status. And very importantly, it's about ideological power, which is a slightly complex concept, but it's about the power that people in more privileged positions often have to shape other people's meanings, values, ideas, and assumptions. It's about social norms and expectations. It's about all that stuff. So that's more difficult to unpick, but ideological power is usually at the basis of all sorts of other misuses of power. So, for example, we have an ideology at the moment about kind of rolling back the welfare state and austerity and all the rest of it, and that is sold to us through the use of, particular forms of language, like, immigrants that are going to swamp. The swamp would be a word, wouldn't it, that might be used, swamp the country, or kind of, benefit scroungers and all the rest of it. So ideological power is at work often through the use of language, and often operates to the advantage of people who are already more privileged and to the disadvantage of people who already are less privileged. And from our point of view, biomedical model psychiatry is an example of ideological power in operation, because it's not evidence-based, even in its own terms. It, on the whole, operates in the interests of people already more powerful, including powerful businesses. And we know from the figures that, on the whole, it operates to divest people who are already in less privileged positions and who come into contact with services and who are very likely to turn into long-term patients. On the whole, people will not get better in psychiatry.
Yeah, I like that. We'll just leave that hanging in the air, that the DSM, by its own admission, is not evidenced in any way.
No.
But that ideology of power, I talk about the ideology of austerity. I refuse to just call it austerity, because that gives it...
sort of some sort of legitimacy, doesn't it?
Yeah. But the ideology of power, there's something very sociological about that concept that I like, because that's my first subject, sociology.
Sociology has a lot to offer.
It really does. Yeah, it really does. So that whole ideology of power, I think that's a really good way for people to think about that. So power, threat.
Okay, so these are not four separate things: power, threat, meaning, and threat response. They're different aspects of the same phenomenon. So as soon as you start talking about power, you, in a way, are automatically talking about. So we're saying that, power is not bad in itself. People like me and you are using our power, we hope, helpfully. And power is neutral, but the negative operation of power obviously poses threats to us in various areas of our life. Some of which we're used to thinking about, some of which we're less used to thinking about. So threats to our physical well-being, our emotional well-being, our social links and connections and so on, but also threats to our ability to come up with our own values and meanings about our own lives. So that kind of links in with the ideological power, if you like. This useful term, epistemic injustice, which roughly means when people lack the shared social resources, knowledge, confidence, connections to make sense of their experiences in a way that is, is meaningful for them. And again, the imposition of a diagnosis would be an example of this. I, the expert, am telling you, the patient, who officially knows less about it than I do, that you have a personality disorder, let's say. And the person who is told that will very often not have the resources to challenge it in any way, and of course may be actively opposed if they do. So it's an example of epistemic injustice.
Another one. So we've got ideology of power, epistemic injustice.
Yeah, so that's a particular kind of threat, which again, we're not used to thinking about. If we buy the medical model stuff, that's just telling people they've got this, like you might diagnose them with lung cancer, but it's not same thing. It's not an analogy.
And what I'm thinking about when you're talking about that are the multiple layers of disadvantage that
Yeah,
that sit underneath being that powerless person.
absolutely. How do people get into services in the first place? Generally because they have had less access to power. What do services do? Take away, to some extent, the forms of power they do have, give a very unsatisfactory substitute, I would say, in the terms of relationship with services, which has all sorts of pros and cons, and actually further disempowers them, but also silences them.
Mm.
You know, many critics of psychiatry that say, well, what's it doing there if it's not actually helping people? And the short answer has often been, it's sweeping up society's casualties and labelling as having them as having individual illnesses. That's where you lose the link between personal distress and social injustice and inequality by applying a diagnosis. It's a very effective way of severing that link. And one of the main aims of the framework is to put that link together again.
Yeah, and is underpinned by othering, isn't it?
Of course it is. It's those kind of people over there that are mentally ill.
Yeah.
And, it's another very important thing about the framework is it's about all of us. All of us can be subject to the negative impacts of power. All of us have distress at times. All of us has our ways of coping. We do not recognise a division between people who are officially mentally ill and those who are not.
Mm. And let's think about meaning. Let's think about meaning. So I'm guessing
Okay.
how we make sense of all of that.
How we make sense of that? Well, everything is filtered through meaning. How we respond to the impact of power is going to depend at least partly on the meaning we make of it. Take a very simplistic example. If we're unlucky enough to have been abused as a child and we were able to tell someone and be believed and supported and protected, the meaning we take on will be very different from if we didn't feel able to tell someone, or if they disbelieved us, or if the perpetrator told it was our fault. It's the difference between bad things happen, but mummy and daddy will look after me, and I'm a naughty, bad little girl, and everybody will be cross, and I will have done something deeply shameful. Those are very different meanings, aren't they? It's a kind of simple example in a way. So what sense did you make of it is important, and a lot of one-to-one therapy is about changing meanings. It wasn't my fault that I was raped, hurt, abused, whatever. But we really, really wanted to expand meaning beyond those purely, or to some extent, personal meanings, because of course they come in patterns. So the example that I often give is why every single woman I've ever worked with who was raped, for example, told me it was my fault, I feel so ashamed, I shouldn't have done this, I should have run away, or I should have done that, or I shouldn't have worn these clothes, or I shouldn't have been there at that time of night, or whatever, because those meanings are shaped by wider social discourses, aren't they? About how women ought to behave and all the rest of it, and who's responsible for these things, and how men are allowed to behave. If the rape was a man and a woman, which of course it isn't always. And those discourses themselves come from wider ideologically driven meanings, like, are we as a society prepared to face up to the true prevalence of violence and harassment and abuse that routinely happens in women's and girls' lives? Or would we rather, in all sorts of ways, collude with a narrative that ends up blaming the individual, and the individual ends up blaming themselves? So there's powerful ideological forces driving these particular personal meanings. And I don't need to tell you this, I know, but one of the ways of undoing that is to go beyond one-to-one therapy and to have women in groups, for example, so we can share these experiences. So we can say, well, I can't believe you think it's your fault. And so then I can think, if I'm the other side of the room, well, perhaps it wasn't my fault. And so then we can start to think, well, where do these meanings come from? And then we can start to put responsibility back where it belongs. And then for some people, we might want to turn to some kind of campaigning for change, some kind of activism, optional, of course, but some people, I suspect both of us are examples of this, will want to turn personal distress into some kind of way of making meaning out of those experiences, such that, other people can benefit from what we may have experienced.
Mm.
So the example I'm giving is partly based on some of the work I did in my last clinical job in South Wales, where we set up a programme of sexual abuse survivor groups for women who've been abused. But there are many, many examples.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, God, I've just loved talking to you, and really having a deeper conversation, an interdisciplinary conversation, cross-sector conversation, you know, that makes sense to me. All of the divisions and creations of different services, the medical model approach to distress, like, has been a real challenge for me across the years, really. And so I feel like I'm honoured and humbled to be part of this wave, and, you know, really excited by the people that are on that wave too. And, you know, it's been great talking to you, Lucy, and I'd just like to thank you so much for your time today.
Not at all. It's been a pleasure to talk to you. And if I send you some links and things, you can put them at the end. And if people are interested, they can follow them up.
I'd love that. Thank you so much.
Thank you.